Where does one begin with American foreign policy? It's very troubled. It creates a lot of problems. I think for as long as I remember, and this now is quite several decades, at least for 55 years of my political memory, the U.S. has been at war almost nonstop. And this goes with the territory, and we're at war again, because the war in Ukraine is a U.S. war with Russia, in which Ukraine is the territory. Ukrainians are dying, Americans are fighting, funding, and defining the war aims. So this goes back a long time. My political life began marching on the streets of Detroit, Michigan against the Vietnam War. My political awareness began with the Pentagon Papers, which explained that American leaders lied repeatedly about the war, mainly to get to the next election. And Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers, wrote a wonderful essay in 1970, which has stuck with me for 52 years, where he said the quagmire myth and the stalemate machine. And he was trying to explain why the U.S. was stuck in Vietnam. And he said that the usual expression is, we walked into a quagmire. And he said that is not the right model. The right model is what he called the stalemate machine, which is never admit defeat before the next election. But since there's always a next election, you never have the opportunity to admit defeat. It was only with Richard Nixon's impeachment that actually Gerald Ford was able to end the war in Vietnam. Otherwise, it would probably have gone on for another 50 years if it had been continuous presidential administrations. We specialize in perpetual war for two reasons. One, the wars are almost always a mistake because they are an attempt to address political issues through military means in a completely flawed way. And then once in, they can't be stopped, almost without exception, or at least until 15 or 20 years has led to exhaustion. So we were in Afghanistan for 20 full years from 2001 to 2021. Biden used his first year to pull out of Afghanistan. I thought maybe there would be a year of peace, but that was a little naive on my part, because instead of negotiating with Putin at the end of 2021 over very pertinent issues like the enlargement of NATO to Ukraine, which is the main casus belli of this war, Biden said, I will not negotiate. And so we find ourselves back at war once again. I find all of this deeply disturbing, but am extraordinarily worried that we are about to enter more war in Asia, because we are actually in two fronts now. One is the war in Ukraine, which continues to threaten to expand because, again, the model now is never allow defeat. If anything is on that path, escalate, which is not good when it's two nuclear superpowers. That's a pretty dangerous logic, but that is the prevailing logic. And if you criticize it, you're called a Putin apologist, which I am not. I want to say right at the beginning. I am nobody's apologist. I just don't like perpetual wars and think that we ought to use other means to resolve these issues. But the United States doctrine, unfortunately, is now rather explicit, and that is that to be secure, the U.S. must be the predominant power in each region of the world. So I liken it to a game that I played when I was young called Risk, which is a board game where the aim of the game is to have your piece on every part of the world map. And if you have your pieces on all but a few parts of the map, those places where you don't control could win back the territory that you have. So you're trying to have every piece on the board. Well, the United States has military bases in 80 countries around the world, but alas for the United States, there are 193 countries, so there's a lot of wars to go. Because every place where we have a base, but there isn't a base next door, Americans feel a threat, or we're told to feel a threat. And moreover, of course, and the deeper point is China is now perceived by the United States as an existential threat to American primacy, because American policymakers cannot understand how we made the mistake of letting China become a powerful country. This was not in the playbook. China was supposed to develop in a way that is subservient to the United States. And so now we call it a failure that we made various mistakes, like letting China in the World Trade Organization or letting China play institutionally. This is obviously a mistake. Not, in my view, because China did anything wrong. And as a development economist, and I think a pretty good one and a pretty knowledgeable one, I would tell you that China has managed economic development better than just about any place in world history, with a lot of skill and a tremendously high saving rate and a tremendous determination to catch up from a century of impoverishment. And they've done it quite brilliantly, in fact. But in the US view, they cheated, and now they have to be punished for threatening American security. So every day you read stories about how the US is cutting off technology to China, telling all of us, don't you dare buy a Huawei phone, don't you dare use Chinese technology. Every day, new companies are listed on the so-called entity list, which is the American enemies list of foreign enterprises. And all of this is to say briefly that we're threatening a second front of war right now. Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan was an exemplar of complete irresponsibility, complete provocation, complete disrespect to another major power, complete abnegation of the one China policy after we had been asked repeatedly, do not go right now. And it's like, in my view, although I have to tell you, everybody hates me for saying it in the United States. I just got more hate mail before I walked on the stage. It's the same kind of provocations that led to the war in Ukraine. We'll talk about that. I'm supposed to say that this is an unprovoked war that started on February 24th because Putin is an irrational madman who thinks he's Peter the Great. That is the official line. This is not how the war started. This is not the background to the conflict. This is not an understanding, nor is it an approach that could possibly end this war safely. This war started when the United States decided it would move NATO to Ukraine and to Georgia. And if you look on a map, the idea quite explicitly laid out by Zbigniew Brzezinski, whom I knew, and who really did not like Russia as a true Polish patriot, was that we could have NATO in Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia, thereby surrounding Russia in the Black Sea, in Sevastopol. And this is, to my mind, just the second Crimean War, because that was the idea of Palmerston and Napoleon III, and we're at it again. Boris Johnson fantasized that he was Palmerston. I don't know what the Americans think, but in any event, I'm worried about a two-front war that continues to spread, because right now, one is not allowed to say one word of what I've just told you. in the mainstream US media to have this debate, to discuss the origins of the crisis, to say anything other than we fully support Ukraine, which to my mind means loving them to death, to their death. And I warned the Ukrainians that at the start of this, that they would become the Afghanistan of Europe. And by that I meant years and years of destruction, all in a patriotic call to battle, as opposed to a clear statement that the US will not expand NATO to Ukraine and Russia should get out and we should leave a space between the two superpowers and keep things safe. I regard, by the way, and I'll stop here, Austria's State Treaty of 1955 as one of the great successes of diplomacy of modern history, a demonstration of how actually to make peace with a belligerent counterpart, something that has made this country remarkably successful. And I wish the lesson were understood for Ukraine, because Ukraine could have learned from Austria. Instead, Austria is often told, stop your neutrality. Please don't do that. We should really understand that a bit of mutual prudence, a bit of regard for another superpower can go a long way to preventing war, but not if you're aiming to put your peace. And what a pleasure it is to be together. And I really hope we can have a dialogue also, so I can hear what's on your mind and questions and brainstorming together on the complexities of the world today, which is, in a technical term, a mess. We're really with more crises, more confusion, more disagreements than I can recall during at least my professional career, which is now 42 years of professional work in economics. Thank you for the reminiscences of 30 years ago, the start of the transformation. And I'll start back 10 years before that just for a moment, because I studied economics in the 1970s, and that was an era of stagflation as we have right now. High inflation and big shocks to output. And I thought that's a good thing to write a dissertation about. So my dissertation in 1980 was on stagflation and supply shocks. And my first book was called The Economics of Worldwide Stagflation, exactly 40 years ago this year. So I'm living a deja vu from 40 years ago, because stagflation is back. So I've seen it before, and it gives me some thought. I didn't want to see it again this way. Like the stagflation of the 1970s, so many of the causes of our crisis are human-made blunders and mistakes. We've done it again, and we should really learn better from the past. And the events of 30 years ago, those early days of transformation, also continue to have a big shadow on today in ways that I didn't expect. Because after I got involved with stagflation in the early 1980s, we had a terrible economic crisis worldwide in the 1980s, in the developing world, and in Central and Eastern Europe, of course. Big debt crisis that came in part from the end of that stagflationary period. You'll recall that because of the high inflation in the early or maybe you won't recall, it's ancient history, but at the time of the high inflation of the late 70s and early 1980s, after some failed attempts to control the inflation, finally the United States got a new governor of our central bank, the Fed, who was 2 meters tall and smoked big cigars, Paul Volcker. And he put interest rates up to 20% in the US, which was unprecedented. Through a deep recession, ended the high inflation in the US, but created a debt crisis worldwide. That made my career, I have to say. Thank goodness for Volcker and his big cigars, because many countries started to call and say, we have a big debt crisis. And in 1985, I went to Bolivia, which had a massive debt crisis and a hyperinflation as a result of the debt crisis, very classical. And I helped them to end the hyperinflation in part by repudiating the debt. That was an idea that I took from the 1920s and the 1930s. So it was history repeating itself. And in the 20s and 30s, the debt crises were ended in part through defaults or renegotiations or cancellations of the debts, sometimes too late, sometimes only after World War II. But in any event, I took those ideas and helped Bolivia cancel its debts, and the inflation ended. And then in early 1989, I was called by an official in the Polish embassy in Washington who came to Harvard and said, we also have a debt crisis. Can you cancel our debt? It was January 1989. And I said, I have to confess, I'm really on the side of solidarity. It's under, Lech Wałęsa's under house arrest, and there's martial law. I can't really help you. And he said he understood and called me back 4 weeks later and said, we're going to eliminate martial law. Now will you come? That was not my doing. It was just the matter of timing. And so I arrived in Warsaw on April 4th, 1989, the day of the signing of the Roundtable Agreement between the government of President Jaruzelski and the Solidarity Movement. And I became an advisor to the government and to Solidarity for a couple of months. And then after the June 4 elections in Poland, to the Solidarity Movement alone. And I'll say one word about shock therapy, which is that they asked, what should we do? We're broke, we're bankrupt, it's hopeless. I said, it's easy, your debt's going to be canceled. So don't worry about the debt. And they looked at me a little bit like I was crazy, which I probably was. But I was asked to write a plan for market economy. And it was in the apartment flat of a wonderful Polish leader named Jacek Kuron, who went from jail to become the Minister of Labor. And he was a close advisor to Lech Wałęsa. And so one night, I spent about 4 hours describing my idea of what a market economy reform would look like. And he didn't speak English, I didn't speak Polish. We had a translator. There was a lot of smoke, a lot of whiskey that he was drinking. And every few minutes he'd pound on the table, tak rozumiem, tak rozumiem. I understand. And at the end of this, at about midnight, he said to me, okay, you have to write this. Now, we need this in a memo. And I said, of course, Mr. Kuron, I'm going back to the United States tomorrow night, and I will send it to you by fax, at least within 2 weeks. No, tomorrow morning. It's midnight. And so we went to a kindergarten room with the manager of the Gazeta Wyborcza, and they had a new IBM laptop, which was brand new at the time that the US had given them. And I typed a memo all night, and at 7 a.m. gave it back to Quran, how to make a market economy. So that was my all-nighter of writing this. If anyone's interested, I'd be happy to email it to you, because many years later, someone found it in the archives and sent it to me. So I actually have a copy of that all night. And that became the basis of the Balcerovich plan to an important extent, actually. And the idea was to make the currency convertible and open the borders to trade right away. That was the basic idea. And to back it up with two core financial steps. One was a lot of aid, and the key was something I recommended called the Polish Zloty Stabilization Fund, which was to give reserves for this new convertible currency. And the second was debt cancellation. And that theory became called the 7 postcards theory, because the night that the Mazowiecki came into power, there was a meeting of the OKP, which was the Polish, the Solidarity members of parliament. And they invited 2 speakers that night, outside speakers. One was Senator Dole, who was the US chief senator, and he was there representing President Bush. And they invited me to speak. And it worked out very well, because Senator Dole spoke first and said the American people will do anything for the freedom of Poland. And then I stood up and I said, I agree with Senator Dole, and that's why I'm sure that America will cancel all of Poland's debts. And so I said the way out of this is 7 postcards, 1 to each of the G7 countries, and tell them thank you very much, but the Soviet-era debts are gone. And in the end, Poland got about 60% of its debts canceled. The last step was Germany, because Germany was very resistant to canceling debt, as you can imagine. It took Balcerovich, I sent Balcerovich a copy of the 1953 London Agreement between post-Nazi Germany and the West, canceling the pre-World War II German debt. And Balcerovich handed it to Helmut Schmidt, who looked at it in the meeting and said, you know, you have a point. Ended up, Germany supported the cancellation of the debt also. Not 100% as I wanted, 60%. So that was the origins of that. But it's worth all this reminiscing, I hope, to make a geopolitical point, which is that after that happened, I was asked by Grigory Yavlinsky, who was advisor to Gorbachev, to help President Gorbachev in 1990. And I believed that Gorbachev's idea, what he called the common European home, was exactly the right idea for Europe and for the Soviet Union. This is before the end of the Soviet Union. But Gorbachev said we should have a democratic Soviet Union, and it should be completely open, and we should have a peaceful European home, in fact, that stretches from Rotterdam to Vladivostok. I loved Gorbachev. I thought he was a man of incredible integrity and decency, basically, because he believed don't shoot people. This was his most core belief, don't shoot people. That was remarkable for a Soviet leader. And it was the greatest statesmanship of the age. And so he, as you know, and Hungary led the way in every way, opening the borders and showing the different path. Gorbachev said, we will dismantle the Warsaw Pact. And it happened, at the time that Helmut Kohl and Hans-Dietrich Genscher and George Bush. Of course, he's credible. The account is correct. It has not been actually shown to be wrong in any meaningful way. The United States did this. The German government should explain to the German people what's going on, period. This is not even a mystery. The United States announced it would do it. The United States celebrated when it happened. Victoria Nuland, who is the point person of the U.S. neoconservatives, said that the administration is delighted that Nord Stream 2 is a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea. There are only 2 or 3 countries that could have done this. I don't think Germany did this. I doubt it. But if the German government did it, they should tell us. I don't think that Sweden or Denmark did it. It's in their exclusive economic waters. The United States did it, warned it, celebrated it, and anyone who understands U.S. politics at all knows that for many years this was an absolute cause of the right wing to stop this pipeline. Now, the failure of the German government and the media to discuss this goes to absolutely foundational issues of democracy, because right now the public is not informed about almost anything that is of fundamental significance for our survival. The real issues of the war in Ukraine, the real state of the war, the U.S. blowing up the pipeline. The mainstream media think that it's perfectly appropriate not even to cover these stories. And by the way, is this conspiracy theory? Yes, it's a conspiracy. A conspiracy means that several groups work together to carry out an illegal action. This is a conspiracy of U.S. policy leaders, probably together with the German government, which probably knew about this in advance or parts of it. I'd be very surprised if the German government doesn't know about it in detail now. So yes, this is a conspiracy, and calling it a conspiracy theory only makes clear no individual could have blown up the Nord Stream pipeline. This was a group. This was a very hard thing to do. It's 70 meters below sea level. It was delayed detonation. If anybody knows about Nord Stream, it's encased in a massive amount of concrete. This was a big operation. So a conspiracy? Absolutely, yes.
At the end of February, you held a speech at the United Nations Security Council and stressed the need for an independent investigation into who bombed the Nord Stream pipeline. How have major countries such as the United States, Germany, the UK, Russia, and China responded to this call? And what do you think the international consensus will be if it ever turns out via whistleblower independent investigation that it was the US?
Well, the Western countries don't want to talk about facts, investigation at all. The Russian government asked for an investigation, an independent UN Security Council led investigation, not a Russian investigation. The Chinese government supported Russia in this, and the United States said this is a distraction. From what? I'm not sure, because it's a pretty central issue to blow up a major piece of infrastructure in international waters. It's not a distraction. It's a major issue of threat to the peace, which is the job of the UN Security Council. So the Western governments right now believe that the public does not need to know, and in fact should not know, basic facts right now, even as we head towards World War III. This is not acceptable. Maybe I'm wrong. Investigate it. You know, but the United States says, no, don't investigate it. That's a distraction. Well, I think it's a distraction most likely from U.S. culpability. But to not investigate? What kind of attitude is that? And it is, again, I have to emphasize, fundamentally a threat to our democratic institutions. The German government doesn't speak to the German people about this. The Bundestag can't get information. The Swedish government went down to the crime scene and then announced that they would keep their investigation secret from Germany and Denmark. Duh, that's a little strange. Or from the UN Security Council. If people think that secrecy is safety right now, they really misunderstand what's happening. We are at the greatest risk of nuclear war in modern history. We are 90 seconds to midnight, according to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. We've not had a crisis like this since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And our governments don't talk to the people like grown-ups. It's propaganda and spin morning till night.
Let us now look into recent developments surrounding Ukraine. The last time I interviewed you, debate on battle tanks was still ongoing. Now it has become a reality, and training of Ukrainian soldiers on how to operate these battle tanks is taking place on German soil as we speak. It is expected that these tanks will go into operation sometime this month. The debate is now moving slowly to fighter jets, and the UK and Netherlands have, for example, voiced their support for sending them. In UK's case, they are already training Ukrainian pilots. During German Chancellor Olaf Scholz's visit last week to the White House, the US also announced another round of military assistance to Ukraine worth up to $400 million. So far, the US has sent $30 billion worth of military aid to Ukraine. Do you think more weapons, especially fighter jets, and military aid could change the tide of war in favor for Ukraine?
Look, there's a bottom line, which is that Russia has 1,600 nuclear warheads. And if Russia were threatened with defeat, for example, losing Crimea, it would likely use them. So the idea of the goals of the war, the tide of war, what we're trying to do, it makes no sense at all. I don't want Zelensky to get us all killed. When Zelensky says they retake every bit of Ukraine as he defines it, including Crimea, no thank you. None of this makes sense. None of this is an honest assessment about the sources of this war, the provocations on both sides, the way to stop this war. None of it. All of this bluster, not just bluster, that's the wrong word. All of this military escalation cannot lead to success, period. It can't. Because even if it led to success on the battlefield, it will lead to global destruction. And there's a very good chance it won't lead to success on the battlefield, though I'm not the right person to interview on that. I listen to bloggers and daily commentators on all sides. Maybe Russia's going to make significant advances in the next weeks. That's what many people say. I don't know. So I can't really judge. But what I can tell you is what we are doing makes no fundamental sense at all. To have a war that threatens nuclear annihilation so that NATO can expand is beyond reckless. To not have negotiations right now, after more than a year, to know, though the media, the mainstream media in Germany and the United States don't cover it, that the negotiations came close to success last March until the United States stopped them is incredible. Did anybody investigate that carefully in the mainstream media? Not at all. Naftali Bennett committed what we call, quote unquote, a gaffe. meaning a politician that accidentally speaks the truth. He said in his interview that they were close to an agreement. He was acting as a mediator in March 2022, and the United States blocked it. And then he said that he thought it was a mistake, but that maybe it was important for the US to stand up to China. Mind you, this is also another trope in Washington right now. I don't know if people in Berlin hear it, but this is not even a war about Ukraine. Who cares about Ukraine? Mitt Romney says this is to show China. And he says it's great, this war, no US bloodshed. This is what's really going on. And so I don't know what these weapons are going to do, except we can be sure that they will kill people. And if they are successful, quote unquote, on the ground, they will bring us closer to nuclear war. And people should understand the US motivations. The US motivations is to be number one in the world, and that's the beginning and the end of it. And if that means war with Russia, that's war with Russia. If that means war with China, that's war with China. That's what Germany has signed on to unconditionally without asking a question.
You mentioned China in negotiations. On the anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, China proposed a 12-point peace plan to end the war in Ukraine. The German media were quick to denounce this plan by stating that it supports Russia's position and interests and does not respect Ukraine's territorial integrity. How do you view this peace plan? Can China be trusted, especially since the West considers China not to be a neutral actor and suspects it of supporting Russia's war with weapons?
No matter what is said, Baerbock and her colleagues will denounce any talk of peace. Victoria Nuland and her colleagues will denounce any talk of peace. The British, by the way, are the most irresponsible. They have nothing to add, but they love war because they still think they're the British Empire, I'm sorry to say. So they're the most violent of all, and they have nothing to add to this story. So this is denunciations because the neocons are afraid that somebody will talk about peace. What China didn't say anything about territorial settlements. It said to negotiate. What China said was to respect the security interests of all sides. Horror, horror. You know what it means? It means that China knows that NATO enlargement is a threat to Russia, as it is, by the way, in part because the United States is expanding NATO to Asia. China sees it in its own neighborhood. Why does NATO, a North Atlantic treaty organization, invite East Asian leaders now? Why does Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, say NATO must shift to China? Well, when China talks about the legitimate security interests of both sides, that's actually right. It's in all of our security interests, by the way, that NATO stop enlarging because it's bringing us to the brink of the Third World War.
The positions that are usually made against diplomacy, most notably by our German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock or German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and I'm quoting Olaf Scholz here, wanting peace does not mean submitting to a bigger neighbor. If Ukraine stops defending itself, it will not mean peace, but the end of Ukraine, end quote. How would you respond to this argument?
Negotiating isn't submitting yourself. Negotiating is negotiating. Shame on confusing negotiating with submission. Who's talking about submission? We're talking about negotiating. We're talking about negotiating issues like NATO enlargement. Is that submission? No, that's common sense. You keep the two sides away. And Chancellor Scholz should go brush off the German archives about all the German promises made to Mikhail Gorbachev in 1990 about NATO not moving 1 inch eastward. Well, Chancellor Scholz is responsible for those commitments too. Let's have negotiations. Let's have discussion. I'm not talking about submission. The idea that negotiations are the same as submission is truly one of the most confused misrepresentations of our time. President John F. Kennedy said it exactly right in his inaugural address in 1961, January 20th. Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. Why is Chancellor Scholz fearful of negotiating? I don't understand. You go and you discuss, but you discuss like grown-ups. You don't just send tanks or aircraft or threats of escalation. You sit down and negotiate. Now, Chancellor Scholz has said he would continue to talk to Putin. Why doesn't he tell his colleague, Joe Biden, you talk to Putin too? We've been at this for more than a year, and Biden hasn't picked up the phone one time. There hasn't been one meeting between the two. When the opportunity was broached by the Indonesians, the United States rejected it around the G20 last year. The U.S. is fearful of negotiating because maybe some truths would come out in the negotiating. Maybe some of the provocations would come out in the negotiating. Maybe the U.S. role in the overthrow of the Ukrainian government in 2014 would come out. Maybe the failures of Germany to enforce the Minsk II agreement that it was responsible for as co-guarantor would come out. Maybe there would be some truths that would be discussed at the negotiating table. But they are afraid to negotiate. And to equate peace with submission or negotiation with submission is a blatant falsehood.
Another point that is voiced very strongly in the media here by leading figures in the European Union, such as Ursula von der Leyen, regularly cite Russia violating international order, law, and that diplomacy that takes into consider territorial concessions will only incentivize as well as send false signals to authoritative states that they can invade any country whenever they want without any repercussions. Therefore, they usually state, no decision can be made without Ukraine's consent. How do you respond to this argument?
Well, Ukraine should understand that to save itself, it should not be the cannon fodder for the U.S. to try to show China how big and strong the U.S. is. The Ukrainians, first and foremost, should read Mitt Romney's op-ed piece. How wonderful this war is. At a small cost and without any U.S. blood, we get to show how big and strong we are. The Ukrainians are the losers in this. Ursula von der Leyen isn't defending Ukraine in this. She's defending the United States in this. The U.S. is using Ukraine. It's not defending Ukraine, it's using Ukraine. It gets to weaken Russia without any loss of U.S. blood. Read Mitt Romney, Senator Romney, very clear. He's explaining to the American people what a great deal this is. We get this war, it doesn't cost us very much, no U.S. blood. So let's defend Ukraine. Let's stop defending U.S. neoconservatism. Let's stop defending U.S. hegemony. Let's defend Ukraine and let's defend peace.
Germany has shifted its position on many issues recently and sided with the United States. We saw a U-turn with Ukraine, for example, where Germany was initially skeptical about Ukraine's membership into NATO before the war started. Now there's a split also between how to approach China. While the US is starting to impose bans on Chinese trade, Germany is being hesitant as China is one of its biggest trading partners. Goods worth around 298 billion euros were traded between Germany and China in 2022 alone. In your assessment, should Germany also draw a red line in case China decides to support Russia militarily?
Germany should understand what's going on right now. What's going on right now is that the US political class thinks that the real issue in the world is US hegemony or dominance. That's what Germany's buying into right now. We could perfectly get along with China, perfectly, if we stop the militarism, if we respect the one China policy, if we have normal trade rather than trying to bust China's economy. The US has been engaging in unilateral, hostile actions to break China's economy for years now. Does anybody watch this in Germany? Does anybody understand what's really going on? I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe the media are just completely sucking their thumbs and absolutely brain dead. I don't know what's going on in German media. But the German people should understand what this is about. Is Germany's role to defend US hegemony? That's the bottom line. I don't think so. I think Germany's role is to defend Germany's security, European security, and that comes through peace. That comes through coexistence. Are we going to wish China away like the media and the hardliners want to wish Russia away? We're just going to close our eyes, wish 3 times, and China won't be there anymore? You know, people need to understand what this is about. And what this is about is the US leaders, these neocons, can't get it through their head that the US can't run the world anymore. But Germany can't figure that out enough to keep its economy going, enough to say don't blow up our pipeline, enough to say we have a major trading partner with China. I don't know. Maybe the media don't explain anything. But if people would look, they'd understand what this is about and what's really in Germany's interest and what isn't in Germany's interest.
Russian President Vladimir Putin, in his annual State of Nation address, announced the suspension of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, also known as START, that aimed to cap the number of strategic nuclear warheads that the United States and Russia could deploy. Why do you think Russia is endangering the security of the globe by doing away one of the most important treaties signed in human history?
They said that they don't want inspections right now because they are at war with the United States. They said that they would abide by the treaty, but that they don't want inspections under the treaty. So this was a very specific thing involved with the war. But there's a more general point on nuclear arms, and that is the United States broke the diplomacy towards nuclear arms control by unilaterally abandoning the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002, which is one of the provocations that put us on this path to war, and on other treaties as well, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement. So this is terribly dangerous. And war is terribly dangerous between the US and Russia because it's the 2 largest nuclear weapons countries, more than 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons on each side. And that's why the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has said that we are 90 seconds to midnight, not just because they felt like it, but because they're analyzing and trying to communicate with the public. Did the German mainstream media cover that story? I doubt it. But this is what's going on. And when we look at the background to this, we can see that the obstacle to peace and coexistence is the drive for US hegemony. And by the way, this is, if you follow it, it's all in the open. People should read, as distasteful as it is, Robert Kagan's book, the jungle grows back. Because Kagan believes that all progress in the world is due to the US leadership. Well, it's worse than a cartoon. But Kagan happens to be the husband of Victoria Nuland, who's the point person for all of this. This is the neocon text. People should read it to understand what's going on. Is this really Germany's vocation to support this simple-minded, extraordinarily dangerous point of view?
Let us now switch to latest developments surrounding China. Many analysts say that we are already in a Cold War with China. We had the recent balloon incident over the US, which the US shot down and claimed was a surveillance device, while the Chinese claimed it was a meteorological one. The US, on the other hand, is expanding its presence in South China Sea by establishing 4 military bases in the Philippines. Both countries also hold regular military exercises amid rising tensions with China. US and Japan officials have also stated that they will expand their military cooperation, including improving Japan's missile strike capabilities, as well as improving the US's marine capability in Okinawa. In your view, is US protecting democracy and freedom in the region and enforcing international order? Or is there another agenda play here that we do not hear in the political and media discourse?
What the US is doing in East Asia is what the US did in Ukraine. And it's going to lead to the same kind of war. Now, of course, to understand that, you have to follow events. Clearly, the media won't tell you. But the media didn't tell us about the overthrow of Yanukovych. The media didn't tell us of what Victoria Nuland was doing. It took a Russian intercept of her phone. And people should listen to it, even till today. Because who was engaged in the overthrow of Yanukovych? It was Victoria Nuland speaking on the phone, not only with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piat, but talking about her conversations with none other than Jake Sullivan and Joe Biden. So it was the three of them back in February 2014. Well, we took a decision in the United States. I don't say we, the American people, because the American people aren't allowed to know anything or ask anything about any of this. But the neocon leadership took a position in 2014 that China's continued economic rise was against U.S. interests. You can even read these texts if you pay attention. For example, there were specific texts by Robert Blackwell, a former colleague of mine at Harvard, who wrote that it's no longer in America's interest, China's rise, writing back in 2015. I was shocked when I read it. It was a deliberate statement. Okay, we now need to oppose China's growing prosperity. Well, how are you going to get peace out of that? So the United States started to introduce unilateral trade measures in violation of every agreement that we have, including the World Trade Organization, which the U.S. has thrown away as if it's a piece of trash. And then under Biden, everything has become worse because the U.S. now tries to break any Chinese enterprise that is in technology. The U.S. has stopped the export or tries to stop the export of any high-tech goods because it may have a military use. It may. And now the U.S. it's going to really protect American security. Apparently, we're going to close down TikTok, a dire threat to the American people. And so this is what's going on. It's mind-boggling. It is step by step the path to a war. And by the way, the American neocons are quite open about it. We need to expand. We need to be ready for war. We need to have the war in Ukraine to show China that we're tough. If we aren't tough in Ukraine, they'll think we're weak. In other words, we're sending hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians to death, destroying Ukraine's cities, instead of sitting at the negotiating table to work out some non-NATO enlargement and Russian withdrawal so that we can show how tough we are to China. My God, by the way, I've been through this for more than 50 years because when I was young, everything they're saying now about Ukraine and China, they said about Vietnam. It's the same. It's the same story. We have to be tough. We can't pull out of Vietnam. We have to, in the end, kill more than 1 million people. Why? Because of the domino effect. What would happen to America's prestige? Nonsense then, nonsense today, unbelievably destructive. And really, I hope the German people can figure this out.
To my last questions, perhaps it is possible to end this interview in a positive note that gives people a vision for the future. For those that believe in a multipolar world, that believe in multilateralism, and in a world where all countries treat each other with respect, what advice would you give to people that are watching this video and would like to realize this vision?
First, we have a United Nations Charter. We should tell the UN Security Council, which, yes, includes Russia and includes China and includes the US and includes Britain and France, you go into the room, we lock the door, just like the Vatican locks the door on the cardinals at the conclave, and you come out when there's white smoke above the 38th floor, meaning that you figured out a way to peace. We have a UN. Let's use the UN. That's the purpose of the United Nations Security Council. Not sound bites, not pointing fingers, but getting down to the work of peace. That's the first thing. Second, we have a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It celebrates its 75th birthday today. Let's honor that. Let's understand, by the way, those rights include economic rights, that people have the right to health, that they have the right to education, that they have the right to social protection, that they have the right to food, that they have the right to a safe environment. Let's live like human beings and like grown-ups. And let's understand, by the way, we don't need a hegemon. We don't need the United States, which is 4